Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon or good morning wherever you are. I'm just going to make myself visible. Thank you for joining me. I'm Nicholas St. Pierre. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Agilicus. We'll wait just a minute before we start to allow some people to join. And then we'll start the webinar today on the need for strong audit trails in industrial control system for compliance. We'll go through that. If you're new to our webinar, this is more of a platform showcase. So we'll talk about audit trails, the tools, and at the end we'll show why the Agilicus AnyX Zero Trust platform enables this. So a little bit of an insight into ICS compliance, and then real world example of how we can audit users that use a zero trust access platform. For a little bit of housekeeping, if you have any questions, you have a dialogue to ask question. If we have time, I'll certainly go through that at the end of the presentation. The presentation should last between 30 and 40 minutes, and we'll get started momentarily. All right, so let's get to it. Again, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Today's Agilicus platform showcase presentation is about the need for strong audit trails for industrial control system compliance. I am Nicholas St. Pierre. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Agilicus, so welcome aboard. We'll go through this and show you some examples of what that means. As I go through the presentation, I will be presenting some of the audit tools that are present quite often in the IT world and how they are used in the OT space, and also how we can merge the two. So when we have zero trust and identity-based access, why we can be compliant in our risk management policy to continue to provide a good security. So first off, let's talk about zero trust and what that entails from Agilicus when we talk about our platform like AnyX. Ultimately, in an operational technology and industrial control system, we want to continue to ensure uninterrupted services. That's the number one priority versus stability, for example, or last versions of software, for example, in an IT world. What we provide is a very easy and transparent way to access resources in critical infrastructure and operational technology settings. We do so by meeting and exceeding mandated cyber security requirements and recommendations, whether they're governmental, whether they're industry focused, to do it very simply, and also to bridge the gap between what we typically see between IT and OT, right? We typically have this market demarcation or DMZ between these two zones. So when we get into more distributed control systems example, these tend to get murky and, for example, have more access to cloud instances and cloud computing. So what are we going to cover today? First of all, let's look at why we need to have audit capabilities in industrial control systems. We'll look at terminology that are more frequently used in cybersecurity and OT and IT space, and in cloud, for example. We'll look at what GRC is, what that's all about. How can we track usage and access with people's identity, especially when they use multi-factor, for example, especially in an environment in OT where we may have shared credentials. Using a SIEM, what's a SIEM? And looking at tools, for example, like ELK stacks, like Elasticsearch, for investigation that are typically used for threat hunting, for example, on live data. So when we have users accessing our critical infrastructure and we need to audit the access, how do these tools come together from a zero trust platform to the audit tool to the regulatory and compliance tools? And I'll look at the NEX implementations, how we get that done when we allow identities either employees, contractors, third-party seasonal workers, for example, into our critical infrastructure for access to resources. And I'll give you a live example of how we can actually configure this audit trail and how we find who's done what in our system. So let's look about operational technology. Our network audits, important in the context of OT. We would assume so, however, for the longest time, the OT network has been completely segmented in our Purdue model, and we haven't had really an ease of audit into these networks because they've been first isolated, and access to these networks have been extremely limited to simple either few users or shared user credentials, which makes it very difficult to understand who's done what when everybody shares a user access and a password. So yes, it is critical nowadays in industrial control systems to have the capability to audit. The reason for that is more and more of the internal tools that we have in operational technology now are cloud connected, for example, for operations that might be as simple as licensing themselves on a subscription model, or for example, pushing analytics to a historian in the cloud that adjusts parameters and then pushes it back into our local infrastructure. So that transaction that occurs sometimes requires more permissions, more access, and it becomes important to keep the integrity of our OT networks intact. And how we do this? Well, there's a couple things. First, if we can identify vulnerabilities through the tooling, we can review our network configurations, we can identify security gaps, but also ensuring compliance. And there's many industrial standards that are driving these requirements. For example, ISA 99 that will drive that, and we'll look at in the next slide in the 62443 standards. Specifically in the section 4-2, when we talk about the requirements for both use control categories and system integrity category, drive some audit and logging requirements. They have different levels of security level capability, or SLC, from 1 to 5, for example, or 1 to 4. But generally in our OT, driven by the industry standards, we need to have auditable events. What those are is people logging in, people using the API. We talk about this a little bit later. But what interaction do they have with our industrial tooling and equipment? The second one is notification of integrity and violation and tampering attempts. Those are both for the critical infrastructure, but also the audit tool. Do I have access to all of my audit records? Do these audit records have good integrity? Have there been access or unauthorized access attempts into these tools? We also have some mandate of where we keep the audit information, how long we keep it for, what's the integrity, where we write it. For example, there's a requirement to write to read-only media that's acceptable, like CD-ROM storage and archiving. We have to go back to 1999, obviously, for the standard to sort of reflect the time and place where it was written. But also what is interesting is the programmatic access to audit logs. There's a standard by which we should be able to have tooling to access these audit logs, so we can use event management, for example, we can use our GRC platform. So it's not new in the OT space. The requirements are there, and we need to actually move on and implement it. The reason for that has been certainly a surge in the number of compromised ransomware attacks, for example, BitLocker, CryptoLocker, that have occurred in critical infrastructure and ICS systems around North America more particularly. A lot of these are done through compromised credentials. A lot of them are caused by vulnerability that aren't patched in software, and typically that starts with exposing some critical infrastructure resources that may not have been patched for the sake of business continuity or the operational status of the software. Maybe it's an old laptop, an old version of Windows, and so on. And we expose more than we should of these resources to either third party or contractors, and a vulnerability is exploited. Manufacturing industry ranks as the #1 vector for attack. It is an easy prey, it is an easy target, and there's a lot of them available, and there's a lot of them present through the public internet, for good or for bad. So all of the OT attacks, 61% we see, are in the manufacturing industry, specifically for OT. And 36% of all these OT attacks are ransomware. And we talk about the operational status being the priority of OT networks. Ransomware attacks are really crippling in that scenario. So we need to be able to control and understand who's getting access to these resources, limit the scope of access to least amount of privileges or permission for the types of applications being used, and so on. So let's move a little bit about the tooling. What's GRC? Well, GRC stands for Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance. It's a type of platform. It's been typically used in the cybersecurity space. It includes a centralized and integrated solution for managing all cybersecurity related activities. So anything coming in and out of an organization, it's meant to align with your own organizations, whether it's a municipal government, state, or private manufacturing, for example, roles and responsibilities and accountability. So whenever there is an event, either which means we fall out of compliance or we come back into compliance, or there's a vulnerability that's been exposed and we need to document the patching and remediation of that vulnerability, it needs to be documented properly, and we do this through a GRC platform. Again, governance, risk management, and compliance. So the first governance. Governance refers to the set of policies, publish policies and guidelines, for example, on a security strategy, time to response, who's responsible for assets, what's the potential liability if an asset gets compromised, and so on. And we need to define the roles and responsibility of who does what when these get compromised. So there's a chain of accountability and a set of measures that are well documented here in that platform to understand how we proceed with the risk management if these assets get compromised, and the step-by-step of remediating them. So it's not something you no longer have to do on the spot and figuring out how we secure this piece of software now that it's been compromised. That should already be documented. The second one is risk management. So we need to identify, assess, and prioritize all the cybersecurity risk. If this pump, this elevator gets compromised, this is the consequence of this, and we need to have a real honest view of the potential risk. And the platform helps you rank these in level of criticality, which is really important when it comes time to triage. So if you know you have multiple resources that have been compromised, you can assign a priority based on the risk management of these devices. The compliance refer to when are we supposed to adhere to local, state, or federal law, for example, or industry regulations, and then having the internal controls that are tripped when these are being crossed, for example. It can generate reports and analysis either on demand or at regular interval, quarterly, for example, that establishes your security posture in those environments. So it's very important from a compliance perspective. There's also things like incident response and reporting. Whenever an incident, like we mentioned, a threat has been identified, we need to document from start to finish the process. And these platforms allow you to feed in all of the tools or security tools that you may have had and all the chronological step that you will take in documenting the incident response. And then you end up with a very nice folder that tells you the start of the event, the end of the event, and then you become compliant from an audit perspective. The last one that's interesting is that's listed is vendor risk management, specifically in OT. So understanding which vendors have access to your platform, especially in a zero trust environment like Agilicus, and understanding what security requirements they have and what risk they may introduce by having unfettered access to a resource. So implementing zero trust here, it becomes very easy in a vendor risk management category of GRC. There's other factors like performance monitoring, so a GRC can alert you, but it's on KPIs and so on. It's not necessarily the go-to reason for using GRC in an OT environment. So when we talk about vendor risk management, from a position of developing a zero trust platform like AnyX, it's very easy to understand how and why we can track usage and access through the identity of the people using it. And when I talk about zero trust in our platform, I'm really talking about three things that we always need to be aware of and have knowledge of when we give vendor access, for example, or employees. First is who. What is the identity of that person? And I'm talking about from an identity access management here, what's the email address, for example, or what device they're using, what multi-factor have they employed to go in, so that I have unrefutable proof of who the person is, even if they're using a shared credential. Second one is what? What is the resource they need to access? Is it an HMI? Is it a manufacturing piece of software, a control system? And what's the level of permission do they need? Do they need only read access to historian logs? Do they need just read access to PLC or sensor status? Or do they need to actually interoperate with it in a read-write manner? So having the least amount of privileges and making sure that this conforms to the role that they have. And the third one is how. How are they going to be securely routed to that resource, and how is that resource going to be protected, and how is the network where that resource is going to be protected from east-west traversal, going sideways, for example, behind a network, which a VPN typically will allow you unless you have pretty strong security policies associated with that. So that's what Zero Trust is for us. When we implement it, we use it with federation. What I mean by that is each person, and not a shared account, for example, uses their existing identity. For example, something that's tied into Office 365, Azure AD, G Suite, for example, if you have a Google operated email domain, and continue to use these credentials. That drives adoption, drives ease of use. There's no additional credentials to learn, username and password, for both the user and the administrator to maintain regardless of where you're employed. Could be contractor A.com needs access to manufacturing plant B.com operated by another entity. We can create authorization rule, like I said in the who, what, and how, to understand which user, which resource, at what time need to access this resource. This makes auditing very granular. So no longer do I know that someone's come into my network at midnight last night for an hour. I must be able to define it was Joe that came in at 1:15 to access a SCADA application, and they stayed for 15 minutes and then they signed out. One way to do this that's very elegant through a Zero Trust platform like AnyX is not having to change your security posture. What I mean by that is not having to make a hole in your firewall for an inbound connection for a VPN. Not having to put devices on a DMZ where they're exposed by a single port or multiple ports to sets of public IP addresses. Not having to actually listen to any services on your firewall to allow inbound access, but to actually go through a platform like ours where everything is pre-connected and only access to specific resources are allowed. And we do that through unified identity. Now I'll jump through that a little bit quicker here, but understanding the federated identity I just covered, you use your existing identity, no new username and password, has to work on every single device that you typically use. Legacy laptops, Chromebook, Android device, iOS. Implementing multi-factor authentication where none exists. So you may have an HMI that's driven by an old Windows CE powered screen, for example. You want to allow contractors, but they need to have they need to have multi-factor to access this HMI. No more client and single sign-on across application when we enable it. When we talk about the auditing capability here, this is where we get to. I want to be able to have an outbound only connection. Like I said, don't expose anything from the firewall off the public internet. Fine-grained authorization. We must be able to continue to do resource segmentation the same way we do control zone in an ICS network. And we want to be able to be compliant either with ISA or NIST or EPA, for example, compliance when it comes to water treatment plants. But in the manufacturing space, you want to also have privacy and security by design. Ultimately, what we're talking about today is the detailed auditing. We want to be able to have complete visibility of who is doing what, for how long, and how, much more than we do today when we end out, for example, a static username and password that's being shared amongst contractors. And this is where our platform does this. So as part of our cloud security platform that delivers services from your OT or industrial control systems or even distributed control systems that are connected to the cloud, we provide a full set of authorization management and auditing, and we'll get into that. When we want to dive into what's in the audit, how can I find the activities? We typically go with what's called a SIEM. Now, this has been used for a number of years in the IT space, but more and more it's being connected into the OT space. So SIEM is the security information and event management. Think of it as you're logging repository where every single device that has to do with security, access logging, syslogs, firewall, intrusion prevention systems, for example, something on your DMZ of your OT network feeds its logs into a SIEM. The role of the SIEM is to host it, to correlate it, but also allow you to do something called threat hunting. Look in real time as to who's doing what across all systems and link it all together into a single pane of glass. So there's many tools to do that. The important thing is we need to be able to integrate into an OT. Once you have that integration done through your tools that can send the data, the security related events into the SIEM, then you have very valuable security insights. You're enhancing your security posture. And we can look at very advanced tooling like behavior analysis of APIs, and we'll look at that as well because that's mandated through APIs, for example. So what does the SIEM give us when we talk specifically about operational technology and event management? So having OT-specific awareness, an OT environment, it's essential to understand that a SIEM solution must be capable of handling OT-specific protocols and reporting and devices. Understand that a PLC and a sensor, a SCADA system, an HMI system may be different. The protocols that are being used, like Modbus, DNP3, OPC, for example, that are being used, that you don't necessarily will see in the schema of a traditional IT-centric SIEM tool. Real-time monitoring. We do so sometimes for operations, but we may not be doing it for access. Typically, that's been a human job, right? So we allow a contractor to come in to grab a VNC terminal, for example, remotely, and then we have the local employee look over the terminal over VNC on another screen to make sure that they follow what's being done. But having the capability to log when third-party or even employees are coming in through real-time monitoring and understand the critical nature of the impact, both on safety and manufacturing, that they may have with the operation becomes critical. If they go into places on the NHMI that are not supposed to, the ability here to process that and analyze that security event. Anomaly detection is an interesting one because it's much more present in the cloud space. We're talking about something called UEBA, or Entity Behavior Analysis. In short, it's basically having a SIEM being able to understand what's the normal behavior of a specific identity coming into your network to access industrial control system tools. When that behavior changes, for example, they try to access different sensors or different interfaces that diverges from either the permissions and the set of access that they have, is to now trigger on that. So it's a learned behavior. It's not necessarily rules-based, but it's really about understanding what's the baseline of activity for an identity accessing a specific resource on my industrial control system, and to be able to alert when that deviates. Think about intrusion detection system, but with no set rules. It's simply understanding when your behavior changes. We also have integrating the SIEM tool into the OT. Whether we have DMZs with firewall rules and understanding when these firewall rules are either stale or aren't part of our workflow to remove them, for example. Understand all the logging of an IDS. And lastly, very important in our manufacturing zones or industrial control zones, is understanding the concept of segmentation. So we're talking here very precisely about the Purdue model and the ability of the SIEM tool to be aware of that. Other than that, there's also, for example, OT awareness and expertise, and also redundancy and resilience, the ability to have the ability to log through outages, for example, because if we have things like crypto lockers or ransomware that may be locking up systems, we need to have contingencies so that our SIEM tool continues to log. So let's look a little bit about more dynamic tools in a SIEM. One tool I like to use is ELK, or Elasticsearch, for example. ELK is a stack that includes Elasticsearch, which is the data lake. We have Logstash, which is the ELT or transformation portion of those logs. And then we have Kibana, the K, which is the visualization tool where we can write rules and see in real time what's happening within our industrial control system, who's accessing what are they doing at any given time. And it does so with very, very large quantity of events. So I can stream a lot of data into these types of stacks and be able to do a couple things. Event correlation. If I see something on an IDS that translates to an event, for example, on an HMI, the same flow, I need to be able to see that. If they're using credentials across systems that they shouldn't, I'd be able to see that as an anomaly. Threat intelligence. Understanding which piece of software I have on my network, in my OT network, that have vulnerabilities that are documented, but I may not be fixing right now because it's the only version, for example, that will run a very specific industrial piece of software. So I need to be able to understand what the threat is and if someone's trying to exploit that. I need to have real-time alerts, so the ability to pop that up either to a security role within my company or on a dashboard or send an email and so on, and having the reports that highlight when these things happen. I like ELK because it provides powerful search. It can be daunting to learn, but once we understand the level of queries, it front ends a SIEM. It's not necessarily a SIEM in and of itself, but it actually allows me, for example, to go real time and see into my organization what I can do and visualize the activity on my network. So let's look at that. What does that look like? In the AnyX platform by Agilicus, I log in with my existing credentials. So I've covered that a little bit, but I sign in with my Agilicus.com username, and I get into a portal. I can see resources that are available to me that have been exposed by the administrator. In this case here, I have a demo website. I have an internal wiki. I have an HMI, and I have a VD-SCADA interface, for example. In this case, when I click on an HMI via the shared application menu, I am presented then with the website exposed to me only because I have been given permission on my identity to interact with this HMI as if I were local on the manufacturing zone. Now, what have I done here? I've provided my existing credentials. I don't have a set default login to go into this HMI. In fact, this HMI is not password protected once I have access to it because it's actually a visualized screen on a control system. Once I have access to it, then I am able to interact with it with a level of privilege that might be enhancing through a web application firewall. I may decide that I cannot click on certain valves, for example, or controllers. But I do have things. I do have irrefutable proof of who I am, where I went, and my interaction with the HMI. So how do I find this? So a platform like ours, like I mentioned, will integrate to a tool that aggregates all of these security information, a SIEM, and I can configure that to stream to one or many of these SIEM. One of them that exists in this case here in the example is OSIM. It's an open source SIEM. I encourage you to go look at it. And I can stream data with a session token, both from an access perspective of what's being accessed on the platform, resources, but also authorization. Who's authenticating against what? Who's using multi-factor? Is their multi-factor working? Are they failing a passcode? And then how many attempts it took and so on. Very important. And then I have an audit destination, and all of it is being siphoned up. We also have the ability to keep and have retention of that data internally in our platform. So if I just want to go quickly and look at who's doing what, I can search very quickly by the identity in the platform that will be pushed as an event into a SIEM, but I can view here what's being used from an API perspective. I talked about behavior analysis. What's Nick doing? Is Nick logging in multiple times every second? Is he trying to rotate his authentication across all applications very quickly, which is unusual? Therefore, I should be able to look into that a little bit more. So I can inspect that very quickly and get a good view of who's doing what. Here I can see I'm retrieving access tokens to access a resource. I also have user activity. So we talked about authorization. Let's look about user activity. I can see here that when I previously on the slide above went into the HMI, that I followed a certain set of steps that allow me to access this HMI. First is I log into my profile, like I mentioned, with my existing credential. Then I try to actually access an HMI, which is the HMI resource I exposed. And then I logged out of this HMI. So I can see very fine-grained activity. I came in, I authenticated with my Agilicus.com credentials, could be a Gmail or a Microsoft credential. And then I perused the HMI, and then I logged out of the HMI. What I also see in greater detail is every single transaction that I've done on this HMI. So it might look like chicken scratch here, but I have a very detailed, that's essentially the record that I will push into a SIEM. I can visualize very basic interaction, and my SIEM will contain every single interaction that I've done with the platform and with the resource. So what do I see in the SIEM? Well, I'll see all of this here. I'll see what browser I used. I'll see what multi-factor authentication I've used, left to right here. I'll be able to trigger events. Did I use bandwidth flood? Did I have a zero-day exploits or try to exploit vulnerability within the application by going through the Agilicus platform, which has a web application firewalls? I'll understand exactly which authorization I was given and which role I was given to access this HMI and which rules I have for my user. And finally, I will be able to go and access the secure network resource, and all of my interaction there is finally, with fine granularity, is being exposed. So now I have all of this in a detailed audit in a SIEM, my security information event management, but also in a GRC. So in my governance, risk management, and compliance, the SIEM can push if there's ever a violation or a non-compliance of a specific requirements, all of this data that led to this violation and remediation as well. So let's look at the same activity when I look into a SIEM or when I peruse it here with Kibana in my Elasticsearch stack. The same data that I saw here that was very verbose, now I see in specific activity, but I also have the ability to visualize this. I can now go and say, okay, well, between now and an hour ago, show me the user ID for Nick, which is explained in the SIEM as a global unique identifier, which is highlighted here as a subscriber. What service did I choose to use? Here I'm exposing the authority of the value is basically the application itself, where I came from, what I visited, and so on. And I can see the same activity that is extremely detailed, but in the visualization I can really filter very quickly what I see, and I can trace the path that I've seen. So think of it as not having an employee overlooking the contractor, but being able then to audit the activity of that same contractor. So let's look at this in real time. I think the proof is in the pudding. I will share a browser here, and I will show you what this looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and do a share in a second. I will share a window for my browser. And you should be able to see here that I am logged into a profile, a portal for a test entity called eGov. And you notice when I log into it, I have to log in with existing credentials. I chose to log in with via Google. I'm presented with ID identities that my browser has, and you'll see my personal email and my corporate email with Agilicus. So I will sign in with Agilicus, and then I will be provided with a list of resources in my profile that I have access to. We looked at the HMI already in the example. This time around, what I'm going to do then is go into a VT-SCADA HMI. When I click on it, I am redirected to access this HMI. This HMI is critical, very important in my industrial control system, and therefore I require a sign-on directly to access this interface. I will log in again with Nick at Agilicus, which is the only identity that has access to this VT-SCADA interface, and then I can log in with demo. Now, the purpose of logging in with demo here is to show you that I'm using a shared credential. If I were simply to audit the VT-SCADA server, I would only see that the user demo from a certain IP address has come forward and now is logging in, obviously the password demo being insecure. So now I have access to a remote HMI. I am able to see who's going in, who's signing in. I can interact with the HMI itself completely. I have a full session available to me. I'm just going to expand that and close it. And I can see all of the systems here, for example, and understand the motors that I may have, and I can turn them on and off and so on. Now notice I'm clicking away and I'm doing some activity. What I can then do here is go into my administrator portal, So if I go and log in here as an administrator, I can then pull an audit for Nick at Agilicus. When I do so, I'll be presented with information such as the resources that I have available for me, and I will see exactly what happened here in my overview of my session audit. I log into the profile, true. I selected to access the VT-SCADA application, which is also true. I can then see exactly the minute interaction that I had with the platform. I came in, I have an identity, I signed in through Google, I have a specific client, and I logged in and I was allowed to log in. I then have the very extensive logging that I will push to a SIEM for my interaction with VT-SCADA. It may seem overwhelming in the amount of data, so what I can do then is log into my ELK Stack. And here I will have, for example, a search that I've created a profile, and we'll just look into it and load it now. And voila. So what do I have here? So if we can see here, I'm just filtering in this Elasticsearch with Kibana that I only want to see. I want to see who used the VT-SCADA via the platform and accessed it, and the user here is being pushed is the global unique identifier for Nick at Agilicus. What I see here in the last 10 minutes or 5 minutes is exactly what I've just shown you. So we started 2 minutes ago, and I see exactly the amount of hits that I have for every single transaction. I have 508 transactions for the clicking around that I did in my platform. I can see exactly which part of the demo I went to, every single interaction if I chose those columns on the path here, and I can see exactly what was clicked. I can reconstruct a full audit with these forensic tool of every activity that occurred. Now, mind you, if I go into the VT-SCADA server, I will see the demo used it, the user demo. Now I know that it's Nick at Agilicus, and I understand exactly which part was used of that HMI. I will stop sharing my screen, and thank you for attending this workshop. If you have any question, email me, for example, at info@agilicus.com. Be happy to entertain a conversation on the cybersecurity tooling, SIEMs, GRC, and the Agilicus AnyX platform, and how they can give you end-to-end auditing when we allow a secure access into industrial control systems. Thanks again for your time, and have a good rest of your day.